I'd like to thank you for joining the Simplex BI webinar today called Getting Started with Aderant Workflows. For those of you who are not familiar with Simplex BI, we were founded in 2019, and I have been, pardon me, my name is Roger Cottrell. I've been working with large law firm financial systems for almost 30 years now. And about 3 years ago, I joined up with my partner, Ivan Stokatelny, to bring our consulting minds together and form Simplex BI. Our focus is to make the Aderant experience better for all Aderant users and to help law firms get more value out of their Aderant systems. So our focus is on implementation consulting and project management. We help firms that are in the process of converting from a legacy system to Aderant with all of the details that go into a project. We often serve as the firm's kind of internal project manager or trusted advisor. We have also helped a number of firms migrate from their Aderant Expert on-premise system to Aderant's new cloud system called Expert Sierra. And if you're not familiar with Sierra, we do have a webinar posted on our website. It's a webinar we held a couple of months ago. Feel free to take a look at that. We also work with quite a number of firms on upgrades, going from older versions of Aderant, putting in patches, implementing new Aderant modules. And then we do a significant amount of SSRS reporting and business intelligence work, and also help firms with integrations. So today's focus is going to be on Aderant workflows. And I know some of you are live on Aderant and probably using some of these workflows. Perhaps some of you have not yet put your toe in the water to start dealing with workflow. So we thought we would just kind of do an introduction, talk to you about some of the ways to implement the Aderant workflows and some of the challenges you might face. So first off, why would you want to implement workflow? Well, one of the primary reasons is that it eliminates duplicate entry in many areas. If you think about the file opening process, if you're still using a manual process of having users complete a Microsoft Word form and emailing that to someone who then enters the data into Aderant, there's a lot of duplicate entry there and a lot of opportunity for mistakes to be made. Workflow also helps enforce firm policies. So by bringing these business transactions into a system that has specific rules for approvals and other limits within it, it makes you adhere to your firm policies, and that can also help with risk management and kind of make sure that you have less exposure to any issues, including fraud. Bringing these processes into workflow also provides greater visibility to where processes stand. So if you think about the billing process, and we'll talk about paperless billing today, throughout the month, you really have no idea if you're using a manual process of who is in control of a pre-bill at any given time, or where in the billing process that pre-bill stands. By bringing it into Aderant, you can easily find that pre-bill and know who owns it at that time. And part of that is that it creates an audit trail. So you can see who has performed the various tasks within the workflow. And if you need to go back and see, why something was approved or who approved it, you can do that by looking back at the audit information. One thing I noticed is when COVID hit and employees were sent home, some firms were really scrambling to handle a lot of their business processes because they had not been automated into a workflow system. So it's, again, file opening, right? So you've got emails flying all over the place. And then when it comes to billing, firms, not all firms had a way to electronically deliver pre-bills to attorneys who were in remote locations. I think anyone that was on paperless billing at the time of the shutdowns was quite happy and was able to continue their business processes as normal. So there are a number of workflows available in Aderant. Some of the workflows that you might consider are a new timekeeper workflow, a pre-bill or paperless billing workflow. You can also use workflow for accounts payable, and you can create a write-off request workflow if you want. And I haven't actually worked with it, but for those of you working with the MatterWorks product, there are some workflows that can be implemented there. One thing I failed to mention earlier is that if you do have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the chat. There's a user called Questions and Comments, Ivan. He is monitoring the questions and will be happy to relay those to me. I will also pause throughout the webinar so that we can address any questions that have been submitted. Anything so far, Ivan?
Nope,
so today, and I seem to have missed a slide here, we're going to focus on the on file opening, the paperless billing workflow, and accounts payable workflow. Okay. So how can you be successful at implementing Aderant workflows? Okay. My recommendation for anyone who has not worked with Aderant workflows yet is to start off with a standard template. If you haven't used the system, it has just a certain way that it works. And before you jump into trying to develop on a platform that you haven't seen, it is extremely helpful to start using the standard template in your test system. Right? So I'm not recommending that you roll out the standard Aderant template, but it's a really good idea to see what is delivered out of the box and then start making modifications to that from there. That way you get a really good idea of how the system works, and it can prevent you from running into some issues down the development path. Right? The next thing that is absolutely critical is you have to define the process. One of the most difficult parts of any workflow implementation is actually making sure that you are implementing the correct process. Sometimes there are documented processes or procedures, but in practice, those procedures aren't really followed. So it's really important that you define what you are setting out to accomplish. Next, it's critical that you validate that process with the users. Again, things that you may feel are going on within the firm in terms of how data is flowing may not actually jive with what's going on out in your office and in other offices of the firm. So critical to validate that process with users even before you start any kind of development. And then once your workflow process has been developed, it is extremely important that you spend a lot of time testing and validating the data. Right? So you are introducing a new way for data to make it into the system. And if that data isn't correct, you're going to be corrupting the data in the database. And you're going to be, you may be stuck with that for a while. So I recommend exhaustive testing and data validation as you go through the process of implementing a workflow. So as I mentioned, today we're going to focus in on file opening workflow, paperless billing, and accounts payable. And we're just going to talk about some of the basics and some of the things that you should consider when you're going through this process. So what does the file opening workflow look like? We have firms of all different sizes on this webinar today. So we're going to show a fairly simple workflow. I fully recognize that the process can be much more complex than we're talking about today, but I want to give you an idea of how you can start out. So typically the file opening workflow is started by a legal assistant or executive assistant working for an attorney. And I find the most effective way to configure this is to have the first form that the legal assistant sees really should just contain basic information. At this point, the attorney is looking to see if they can take on a new piece of business, and that's all going to be dependent on that new matter passing the conflicts check. So at this point, you really only need the basic information about a matter so that it can move through the process over to what's called the names reconciliation and conflict stage. Okay? So on that basic form, you would, of course, capture information like the client name, matter description, and the related parties. And there may be some other information that you want to capture at that point. When the workflow comes to the names reconciliation or conflict check stage, it's typically coming to your conflicts department, which at some firms may be one person, or it may be several people who run conflicts. So when they get that information, they can just run the conflicts check right within the workflow form. It integrates directly with Aderant's conflicts engine, and the user can generate the conflicts report and attach it to the workflow. Now, typically, the conflicts department is not making the decision of whether there are if there is a real conflict here. They may be reviewing some of the hits that were returned in the conflicts check and clearing some of those. But typically, there is some level of risk management review or a conflicts committee. So after performing this conflicts check, oftentimes the workflow will be sent for risk management review along with any kind of supporting documentation about the matter. So if that conflicts review turns out that there is a substantial conflict and the firm cannot take on the matter, so it's not approved, often that will just end the process. You may, in some cases, create a matter that is rejected if you're a firm that tracks that information. Or you could add the ability for the risk management team to send this back to the billing attorney for more information. More often than not, the conflicts check is approved and you're able to move on with creating the matter. And quite frequently, I see an additional matter details task that occurs after the conflicts approval. So if you remember, we only captured basic information in the data entry task. And now there's a lot more information about the matter that we want to capture. This is probably where you're going to get all of your office, department, profit center information. This is where the legal assistant could add participating attorney information and special rate information, etc. Anything that's associated with a matter. Okay? So again, don't force them to put in all kinds of information over here until we know that the conflict has been approved. So once the additional matter information is entered, that usually goes to the person or the department who is responsible for creating clients and matters in the system. So if there's something wrong in this matter, additional matter details, we have the ability to send it back for correction. And you can provide information as to why you are sending it back to the legal assistant, and then they can resubmit it. And then once it's approved, typically that's when the matter is opened. Now, there are a number of things to consider in addition to what I've shown you here. You can create as many different workflow stages or tasks that you want. One that I see frequently is a pending client matter save. So in this example, we didn't create the actual matter until the whole process was complete. But oftentimes, after the conflicts check is approved, firms will create a matter with a pending status. This kind of speeds up the process so that the attorneys can start entering time on that matter. And then once it gets through the full approval, the matter would change from a status of pending to open. Okay. Another option that you can build in is an accounts receivable or WIP check. So you might create a rule that if it's an existing client that if you're opening a new matter for an existing client, if they have accounts receivable that's over 60 days old, you want to know about that. So oftentimes the workflow will get sent to someone in the collections department or cash receipts to review the accounts receivable and WIP. Okay? And these balances, the AR and WIP balances, can be built right into the workflow form so that the user can see what those balances are and then determine whether it's okay to open the matter or not. Another task that is often included is a rates review task. Through this process, it may be communicated that there are special rates on this matter that either need to be approved or entered into the system. That's another task that you can add. And then there's also the ability to have the system automatically run a new matter report. I found even though we're working in a largely electronic world, people still like to kind of review all of the details of the new matter on paper. So the system can be set up to automatically run an SSRS report that will display all of the new matter information if you like. And then lastly, one thing that I encourage you to consider through this process is including on-the-go workflow tasks. And on-the-go workflow tasks enable users to approve workflows on their mobile device or from the desktop in on-the-go workflow. Typically, an on-the-go workflow task would be something that is only in approval. So you might have a stage in here after the additional details that have been entered where the billing attorney needs to approve the matter. So if you configure the system to create an on-the-go workflow task, they can just get their phone and review it and hit complete, and then the workflow will move on. And this is something that I have found that Aderant doesn't, when they're implementing workflows, they don't raise this issue or question very often. It's something you kind of need to be proactive about, to say, hey, I want this approval to be available in on the go. So I'm going to pause just for a second there. Ivan, anything come in for questions?
Nope, no questions.
Anyone have any questions and want to unmute and discuss anything here around file opening? Okay, we will move on to paperless pre-bill. So the way the paperless pre-bill or paperless billing process works is most firms, not all, follow a monthly billing process where you close the prior month, and on the second or third business day of the month, you generate your pre-bills. Right? So with paperless billing or paperless pre-bill, that process remains the same. You just go in and generate all of your pre-bills, and then you do something called launch markups. And launch markup essentially says, put this pre-bill into workflow. Now, you can actually configure the system to automatically launch the markups, launch the workflow when you generate the pre-bill, or you can make it as a separate step. Often I see firms making this a separate step because sometimes the billing department might like to enter some edits to the pre-bills before it actually goes out for the users or the attorneys to review. So once these you've run launch markups, the pre-bills have been sent out to the firm, and there are all kinds of processes that you can put in place to determine who should receive a pre-bill. So I just have a couple very simple examples here, but it can get far more complex. I have one client who I think has 9 different paperless billing workflows that get run depending on the circumstances. So one very simple workflow is that the pre-bill goes directly to the billing attorney. They can review the pre-bill on their screen and make any edits that are needed. Another more common option is that the pre-bill goes to the billing attorney's admin first, excuse me, and the admin will enter the edits, especially the narrative edits, cleaning up punctuation and spelling, making sure that narratives are consistent, and admin is done with it. Typically, it would go to the billing attorney for review at that point. So could go directly to the billing attorney, or it could go to the admin and then to the billing attorney. I've seen workflows that go to the admin, to the billing attorney, back to the admin. Again, it really just depends on the process that your firm follows in terms of reviewing pre-bills. One option that you can build into your paperless pre-bills is a write-down approval. So if there is a write-down of a certain amount on a pre-bill, typically it's a $1 threshold, you can send it for approval. And if it's not approved, it's probably going to go back to the billing coordinator. Or excuse me, if no write-down approval is needed, it's going to go on to the billing coordinator. If a write-down approval is required, it would go to whoever needs to review that and approve that. That might be, a billing manager, controller, CFO, depending on the setup of the firm. And once that's approved, it would go to the billing coordinator. Okay. One thing to consider with your write-down approval is that you want to think about what your dollar threshold is and what components go in to determine the value of the write-down. So, if you have a pre-bill that has $20,000 of fees and you write it down $2,000 to $18,000, obviously that's a $2,000 write-down. But if you also give a 10% courtesy discount on that bill, you're increasing that write-down. And you just want to make sure that you're including all different values in terms of the write-down. And you may also want to include disbursements in there so that it all gets calculated into that threshold amount. A couple of things to consider here is you do have the ability to prepare your pre-bills prior to launching these markups. So if you prepare the pre-bills, then when the workflow gets to the legal admin or the billing attorney, a copy of the actual pre-bill that they may be accustomed to seeing in a printed format will be attached to the workflow. And they can print it if they want to. Kind of defeats the purpose of paperless. But I have found there are a lot of attorneys who still want to look at that paperless pre-bill. Okay. Another thing to consider are transfers. So you do have the ability to transfer time and disbursements within the workflow process. But if I transfer it from matter one to transfer time from, say, matter one to matter two, the time doesn't actually make it over to matter two until it gets back to the billing coordinator. So you just want to be aware of the timing of when changes to the pre-bills get approved and when transfers actually take place. Now, we create rules within workflow, but the rules don't always, fit every situation. So if I receive a pre-bill and I really need another attorney to look at it, I can assign that task to someone else. So this is a manual way of moving a pre-bill to another person. And then another thing that I recommend is that you consider creating a billing coordinator only workflow. And essentially what that means is instead of using these workflows, you create a workflow that just sends it puts it into workflow, but it sends it to the billing coordinator. And the reason I like to do that is sometimes the billing coordinator needs to get the pre-bill to just someone else who's not part of the process. So if the billing coordinator can generate the pre-bill and have it come to them, then they can assign it to whoever they need to assign it to. Ivan, I do see a message there in the chat. Is there anything I haven't looked at it, anything to?
No, the only relevant thing is there's a comment from Chris. He says that the transfer timing was a deal breaker for them. But it looks like Aderant is adding it into their roadmap for an upcoming release in 8.2.2.
Yeah, I mean, it works well within a consolidated pre-bill. So if you've got 4 matters on a pre-bill and you move it from matter 1 to matter 4, it's there immediately. But it's definitely a challenge in that timing, because the attorney's not going to see kind of the final value of the bill, or if those transfers are added later. So thanks, Chris, for pointing that out. Okay, I'm going to move on to accounts payable. Now, in Expert 822, there are really two kind of out-of-the-box methods for implementing AP workflow. And it really depends on how your firm is set up. And you can actually implement both of them at the same time. So the first method that I'm really most familiar with is what I would call a decentralized model. In Expert AP, the workflow is called the new invoice workflow. And what it entails is really it's designed for people outside of accounts payable to enter and submit an invoice for payment. So all of your check requests for filing fees, your IT manager gets lots of bills that need to be paid. So that's why I call it the decentralized model, where all of the information is coming from outside of AP and ending up in accounts payable. And these workflows over time have become more and more configurable within the system. So you can actually set this up on your own, at least for initial testing. So typically, if we just use an example of a filing fee, a legal assistant would enter an invoice into they would launch the workflow, enter the invoice, attach an image to that workflow. And based on the amount of the invoice and where it's charged, the system will determine whether an approval is required. So there's two different types of approvals, and you can have different approvers for general ledger and client disbursements, and they can be on the same invoice. So you may have an invoice that has a portion of it charged to the GL and another portion charged to client disbursements, and those approvals can be sent to different people. There can be different thresholds for approvals in terms of setting dollar limits. Perhaps an invoice over $1,000 requires a second approval. So once that invoice is approved by whoever's responsible here, typically the disbursement approval might be a billing attorney or a assigned attorney. The invoice will flow into accounts payable for final approval. Excuse me, I got ahead of myself. Accounts payable will approve it, and ultimately the invoice will be posted. If no approval is required, it would just go directly to AP approval. You might have your approvals may say that, look, if it's charged to a client and it's under $100, we do not require an approval. So that will come directly to accounts payable, and then the invoice gets posted. So a couple of things to consider. I already mentioned that there are multiple levels of approvals. One of the nice things is that you can limit the general ledger accounts that can be used at the vendor level. So if you are in this decentralized model and you know that if anyone selects this vendor for payment, it has to be charged to this GL account or one of these GL accounts, you can set up the vendor so that only that GL account can be used. And you can also set up the system to automatically post the invoice. One deficiency right now is that GL approvals are only at the account, office, and department level. I'm not sure why they haven't included profit center. Many of my clients have very complex account structures that include the profit center. especially firms that came off of a lead where you're accustomed to having as many segments in the GL account as you want. So if you use Profit Center as part of your approval process, then some customization will be required. Now, if we look at kind of this centralized model, this is where, invoices, if invoices generally come to your accounts payable department in the mail, then you can have your AP department enter the invoices directly into Expert AP. And from Expert AP, they can launch the workflow approval process. And this approval process is really the same as what we just went through. It's really just about where does the invoice originate, right? So if it's originating outside of accounts payable, you want to use that new invoice workflow. If it's originating inside of accounts payable, you may elect to use the invoice approval workflow that just sends it out for approval. And we already covered these items. Any questions, Ivan?
Nope, no additional questions.
Okay, great. So we'll do a little bit of a recap here on how to be successful with your implementation. Again, highly recommend starting off with a standard template, making sure you understand how it works, which will help you determine what you need to change in that process. Critical that you define the process at a very detailed level. Validate that process with end users to make sure what you think what you're developing actually matches what the firm needs. And then just make sure you do exhaustive testing and data validation as you go through this process. Now, one question you might ask is, well, does Simplex BI do workflow development work? We actually do not do development of workflows, but there are many areas that we can help. We can help you with the requirements gathering to kind of determine what that process should be and what information you need to gather throughout your workflow. We can help you design it and develop your test plans. And then often we find our clients that, they're still learning the workflow process. So we will assist with testing. Some of the issues can get rather complex on, why something's not working. We can also help you with documentation and rollout and manage this whole process of getting the workflow implemented. In almost every case, Aderant Professional Services does the actual workflow development. There are a couple of third-party vendors that do workflow development, but it is still predominantly Aderant doing this work. So I hope that you learned something here today. We would be happy to talk to you, answer any questions you might have about workflow, or if you're in the process of implementing Aderant or going through an upgrade, we offer a free consultation just to discuss what your issues are and how we might help. So please feel free to reach out to us and we can set up a time to meet.
And Roger, one question did just come in.
Yeah.
Will we have to implement firm-wide access to Aderant for routing purposes?
Yes. Yes. In order for a user to view and approve a workflow, they will have to have some level of access to Aderant, because all of these workflows really flow through the applications themselves. Now, you can control what level of access they have. And when they're, for example, going back to the decentralized AP workflow, the admins, although it appears that they are working in accounts payable, they don't really have access to accounts payable. So the screens look like they're in there, but it's totally locked down so that they can't get to, you know, historical transactions that you might want to make sure they don't see. The centralized version of the AP workflow is different. You are actually entering the invoice directly into accounts payable and have quite a bit of access there. So typically you would use this decentralized model.
Thanks, Roger. That's it for the questions.
Great. Well, thank you all again for attending. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions you didn't want to get into today, or any other Aderant issues that you'd like to review with us. All right, take care.